The room was too bright, the champagne was too warm, and Sylvie Okafor's dress was doing exactly what she'd feared it would do when she'd bought it 3 weeks ago in a moment of cautious optimism. It was pulling, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, or so she told herself, standing near the tall windows that overlooked the frozen Ottawa River, one hand holding a glass she hadn't sipped from in 20 minutes. The Parliament Hill Gala for the National Literacy Foundation was, by any objective measure, a gorgeous event. Crystal chandeliers, string quartet, the kind of people who could afford to be photographed being generous. Sylvie had been invited because she'd spent the last 4 years building a reading program for underserved kids in Vanier, and because the foundation's board chair had called her work quietly extraordinary in a letter she'd read 7 times. She hadn't told anyone that. She'd just bought a dress, deep burgundy, fitted, the kind she never let herself buy, and told herself she deserved to be here. She almost believed it until she walked in. The woman at the coat check had taken her jacket without making eye contact. The man handing out name tags had scanned her face and then her body in a single, dismissive sweep before smiling at the person behind her, and then she'd spent 20 minutes trying to find a single person she knew in a room of 400 before giving up and retreating to the window with her untouched champagne. She knew she was good at her job. She knew, intellectually, what she'd built in Vanier mattered. But there was something about rooms like this, the sculpted women, the easy laughter, the way everyone seemed to belong to some club whose application Sylvie had apparently missed, that made her want to fold herself smaller. She was 31 years old, and she still had to remind herself, sometimes, that she had every right to take up space. Sylvie Okafor? The voice came from directly behind her, and she turned. He was tall, not in a way that announced itself, but in the quiet way of someone who didn't need to fill a room because the room rearranged itself around him. Dark suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone. He was looking at her with the focused attention of someone who had been watching for longer than she'd realized. "That's me," she said. "Renaud Beausoleil." He extended a hand. "I'm on the board. I read your program report 3 times. She shook his hand. Most people skim the executive summary. Most people aren't trying to understand how you manage to improve reading comprehension by 38% in 2 years, with a budget that wouldn't cover the catering at this event. He glanced very briefly at the room around them, and something in his expression told her he found it as absurd as she did. "I wanted to meet you." Sylvie filed this information carefully, the way she always did with things she didn't quite trust. She was good at not trusting things that seemed too good. "The program works because the kids trust it," she said. "And because we hire from the neighbourhood." "I know. I read the methodology section." He smiled. It was not a polished smile. It was the kind of smile that arrived slightly before it was expected. "Can I get you something that's actually worth drinking? The wine at the far bar is significantly better." She looked down at her untouched champagne. "I'd like that," she said. She didn't see Garrett until the 2nd hour of the evening, and she heard him first. She and Renaud had been talking for 40 minutes, not in the polite obligation-clearing way of gala small talk, but in the way that made her forget where she was, the way that happened when she was discussing something she actually cared about. He'd asked follow-up questions, actual follow-up questions, the kind that required her to have said something worth following up on. She'd forgotten about the dress. And then she heard it. The laugh was familiar before she consciously identified it. A particular kind of laughter, bright and performative, the laughter of someone who wanted to be heard. She turned, and there was Garrett Ennis, standing 12 feet away with 2 men she didn't know, holding a whiskey glass and looking directly at her. They had dated for 2 years. They had broken up 8 months ago. He had told her in the final conversation, the one she'd replayed approximately 400 times, each time wincing at the same moment, that he just needed someone who could keep up with him. He'd said it gently. He'd said it the way people say things they know are unkind but have decided are true. She had not argued with him. She had gone home and eaten half a tub of ice cream and cried in a way she hadn't cried in years, and then she had gotten up the next morning and driven to Vanier, and read The Snowy Day to a group of 6-year-olds who were not interested in her heartbreak, and who had inadvertently saved her. Garrett was looking at her now with the specific expression of someone who had been caught off guard and was recalibrating. Then his eyes traveled down, and the recalibration completed. She saw it happen. The polite acknowledgement in his face shifting into something else, something she recognized from the last months of their relationship, a kind of barely there disdain that he thought he hid and didn't. He said something to the men beside him. She couldn't hear it, but she saw one of them look over, and she saw the smirk. Her hand tightened on her wine glass. Renaud beside her had gone very still. She didn't think he'd heard, but when she glanced at him, he was not looking at her. He was looking at Garrett with an expression so flat and steady it was almost more frightening than anger. "Who is that?" he asked. "Nobody," she said. "Sylvie." She was startled by the gentleness of it, the way he said her name not as a prompt, but as an acknowledgement. "I see you. You don't have to pretend with me. His name is Garrett Ennis," she said. "We dated. It ended badly. Can we talk about something else?" Renaud had turned back to her. The flat expression was gone, replaced by something she couldn't quite categorize. "What did he say just now?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do." She looked at her wine. "Something about the dress or the woman in it. I couldn't hear exactly." She said it matter-of-factly because that was the only way she knew how to say things like this, with the tone of someone reporting a weather event they hadn't caused and could not control. "It's fine, I'm used to it." The silence that followed was short. "You shouldn't have to be," Renaud said. She found the library by accident. It was on the second floor of the venue, a restored heritage building that the foundation used for events, and she found it the way she found most things she needed. By following a hallway when she needed air. The room was dark except for the ambient glow from the windows, and it smelled the way all good rooms smell, of old paper and quiet. She sat down in a leather chair by the window and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 2 hours. She'd told herself, coming here, that she wouldn't do this, wouldn't retreat, wouldn't let Garrett Ennis rearrange the evening simply by being present in it. She'd told herself she was past the part where a look from him could unravel her. She was not, apparently, entirely past that part. She heard the door. She didn't turn around. She assumed it was a catering staff member or someone else who had gotten lost, and she was prepared to quietly disappear back downstairs before anyone noticed she'd been sitting alone in a library, which was, she recognized, a very on-brand thing for her to do and also extremely embarrassing. "I thought you might be up here," Renaud said. She turned then. He had 2 glasses of wine. He set one down on the small table beside her chair and sat down in the chair across from it, crossing one ankle over his knee, looking for all the world like a man who had been planning to end up in this library all evening. "You followed me." I was concerned. "I'm fine." "You keep saying that." She looked at the wine. "It's a useful thing to say. It's a useful thing to say when it's true." He leaned forward slightly. "What did Garrett Ennis do to you?" She'd answered this question before, in the months after the breakup, to her sister, to her 2 closest friends, once to her therapist in a session that had lasted 20 extra minutes and cost her accordingly. She had a version of the answer she'd polished down to something manageable, something that didn't reveal too much. She gave Renaud the unpolished one. "He made me feel like I was a problem to be apologized for," she said. "In restaurants, I'd see him look around the room and then back at me, and I could never tell if I was imagining it, if he was embarrassed. He never said anything explicit. He was too smart for that. But there were all these little corrections, the way he'd suggest I wear a certain thing, or how he'd go quiet when I ordered dessert. And then at the end he said he needed someone who could keep up with him, which I think we both knew was not about hiking." She hadn't planned to say that much. Renaud didn't say anything for a moment. "He was wrong," he said finally. "I know. I mean that specifically." He looked at her in the direct way she was starting to understand was simply how he looked at things. "You built something that works in a city that spent 30 years failing the neighborhood it built it in. You did that with a graduate degree, a small team, and what I'd estimate is a genuinely unreasonable amount of sheer stubbornness. And you walked into a room full of people who have never done anything that difficult, and you let the opinion of a man who couldn't understand you matter more than that." The room was quiet. "That's not quite fair," she said. "I didn't let it. I know I didn't mean it that way." He paused. I meant that the way he looked at you tonight, whatever he said to those men, it told me everything I need to know about him and nothing I need to know about you. She looked at him. Renaud, you are not the problem in that story, Sylvie. He said her name the way he had downstairs, careful and unhurried, like he meant to land it gently. You were never the problem. She looked away out the dark window at the frozen river she could barely make out below. She was not, as a rule, someone who cried at galas. She was particularly committed to not doing it in the presence of a man she'd met 90 minutes ago. He said. She stopped, started again. The last time I saw him before tonight, he told a mutual friend that he felt like he'd been carrying extra weight in the relationship. That was the phrase. Extra weight. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. Where is he right now? Renaud asked. Downstairs. And where is he in approximately 6 months? She frowned. I don't understand the question. Where is Gareth Ennis in 6 months? What has he built? What is he building? What will anyone remember about him? She thought about it. Gareth worked in financial consulting. He was good at it. He was charming and capable, and he would probably, she thought, have a perfectly acceptable life. I don't know, she said. No, Renaud agreed. Neither will anyone else. She returned to the gala. This was a deliberate decision, and she made it the way she made most deliberate decisions, by sitting with it until it felt right rather than merely reasonable. She went back downstairs not because she had to, but because she chose to, which was a distinction that mattered to her. The string quartet had shifted to something slower. The room had thinned slightly, the way event rooms do in the second half of an evening, and the crowd that remained had the particular loosened quality of people who had been talking and drinking long enough to have forgotten what they'd been anxious about when they arrived. Gareth found her before she found him. Sylvie, he said it with a warmth she recognized as performance, the warmth of a man who had been caught doing something impolite and was now demonstrating that he wasn't the kind of person who did impolite things. I didn't know you'd be here. The foundation invited me. She kept her voice even. I built a literacy program in Vanier. Right, of course. A pause. You look well. She knew what he meant by well. She had known for the last 8 months exactly the architecture of every sentence Gareth Ennis had ever directed at her. Thank you, she said. He leaned in slightly, the old conspiratorial lean she knew from 2 years of restaurants and events, and moments when he wanted to say something he couldn't quite say out loud. I didn't realize this was your kind of event. What kind is that? A small smile. You know, he gestured vaguely at the room, the chandeliers, the assembled board members and donors, the big league stuff. She looked at him. The board chair quoted my program in the annual report, she said. And I've spent the last hour and a half talking to Renaud Beausoleil about early literacy policy. She watched Gareth's face change. Is there something you needed? Gareth's eyes had gone somewhere over her shoulder, and she turned. Renaud had crossed the room. He didn't move quickly. He moved the way he seemed to do everything with a deliberateness that didn't rush itself. But he was there now, and he put his hand briefly on Sylvie's arm, not possessively. Just precisely present. Sorry to interrupt, he said to Gareth, in a tone that conveyed he was not sorry at all. Sylvie, the board chair is looking for you. They'd like to discuss the provincial funding proposal. She looked at him. He looked back. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite name, not satisfaction, exactly. More like the quiet certainty of a man who has decided something and is seeing it through. Of course, she said. She turned back to Gareth. It was good to see you, she said, and she meant it in the polite, final, closed-door way that she had been practicing. She walked away. She didn't look back. The board chair, as it turned out, genuinely did want to discuss the provincial funding proposal, and Sylvie spent 20 minutes outlining the gaps in the current structure while the chair took notes and Renaud stood slightly to the side, adding context when she needed it, staying quiet when she didn't. It was the most functional collaboration she'd experienced all year, and she was aware, somewhere below the professional register of the conversation, that this was unusual. When it ended, the chair excused herself, and the room was down to its last 40 people, and the quiet had returned. You didn't have to do that, Sylvie said. The board chair legitimately wanted the meeting. You know what I mean. He looked at her. He was going to say something else to you. I didn't think you should have to absorb it alone. She thought about arguing. She thought about the version of herself who would have argued, would have said, I can handle it. I've always handled it. I don't need someone to manage situations for me. That version of her was not wrong exactly. But she was tired of making every argument from a defensive position, tired of declining help before it had even fully been offered. Thank you, she said instead. He nodded once, like he'd expected she might get there. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes, why did you read the program report 3 times? He was quiet for a moment. Because the first time I thought the numbers were wrong, he said. Nobody gets those results in that neighborhood without significant infrastructure support, and you had none. So I read it again to find the error. A pause. There wasn't one, so I read it a 3rd time to understand how you'd done it. Did you figure it out? I have a theory, which is… He looked at her, the direct, unhurried look that she was starting to feel she might need to develop a resistance to. That you understood something most people in this room don't, he said. That the kids in Vanier aren't behind because they're less capable. They're behind because everyone built systems that assume they don't matter. And you didn't fix the kids. You fixed the assumption. The room was very quiet. The string quartet had packed up. The caterers were moving through with efficient purpose. The chandeliers were still blazing. That's exactly it, she said softly. I know. She looked at the window at the river she'd watched all evening. I almost didn't come tonight. I'm glad you did. I almost let Garrett Ennis ruin it. I know that too. She turned back. I didn't. No, Renaud said. You didn't. She found out later, but from a foundation colleague who had eyes everywhere and no apparent filter, that Garrett Ennis had attempted to approach the board chair near the end of the evening, presumably to introduce himself, and that the board chair had responded with polite but comprehensive disinterest before returning to her conversation with 2 provincial funders. She also found out that Renaud Beausoleil was not merely on the board. He was the foundation's largest individual donor. He had been, for the last 3 years, quietly funding the gap between what the government provided for early literacy programs in underserved communities and what those programs actually needed to function. He had never mentioned it. He hadn't, she realized later, mentioned it because it wasn't relevant to anything they'd talked about. He wasn't interested in being impressive. He was interested in what worked. She called her sister that night, sitting on the floor of her apartment in her burgundy dress because she hadn't gotten around to taking it off yet, and she told her the whole evening from start to finish. When she finished, her sister was quiet for a moment. Sylvie, she said, the dress worked. Sylvie looked down at herself, at the dress that had been pulling at the body she'd been apologizing for in small and quiet ways for longer than she wanted to count. Yeah, she said, I think it did. She ran into Renaud twice more before he called, once at a policy breakfast on the 4th floor of a Centertown office building, where they ended up on the same panel and spent 40 minutes agreeing with each other in increasingly specific terms. And once outside a coffee shop on Elgin Street where she was carrying a stack of binders, and he held the door open with the focused attention of a man who had not simply noticed a door but had noticed her specifically. When he called, it was on a Tuesday afternoon, and he asked if she wanted to have dinner, not to discuss the program or the funding proposal or the provincial gap analysis, but just to have dinner. She said yes. No. She said it before she had time to talk herself out of it, before she could summon the long list of reasons it was complicated or premature or logistically ill-advised. She said it the way she had walked back into that gala. Not because it was easy, but because she was done making herself smaller to fit inside her own hesitation. On the night of the dinner, standing in her hallway in a green dress she'd owned for 3 years and never worn, she looked at her reflection for a long moment. She thought about Garrett and his careful silences and the weight he'd claimed to have carried. She thought about Renaud reading a report 3 times, not to diminish it, but to understand it. She thought about the 6-year-olds in Vanier who had not cared about her heartbreak and had, every morning, looked up at her like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She picked up her keys. She had built something that worked in a place where people had been told nothing could work. She had done it by refusing to accept the wrong assumptions. It turned out that had been practice.